Chapter 14 is called Trouble for Kazima. As police officers told her mum about the incident at the farm, Kazima stared at her shoes, avoiding all eye contact. She had never felt shame like it. Like the boys, she too got off with a warning. The difference, of course, being that the boys' parents did not have to go through the humiliation of having their child dropped off by a police car. What must the neighbours have been thinking? After the police had left, Kazima and her mum sat in silence at the kitchen table. She expected anger from her mum, an outburst of some kind, but as she secretly studied her face, it was more as if there was no emotion there at all. More than anything, her mum looked tired. About 10 minutes must have passed before the silence was interrupted by the phone ringing. Kazima's mum answered it and held the receiver to her ear, still not saying anything. It was hard to tell whether or not she was properly listening to the voice on the other end, but eventually she said, "Tell them Deef we are very sorry. We'll find a way to get him a bit of money until he finds more work." It was only after she'd hung up the phone that Kazima's mum finally spoke to her daughter. "Go to your room," was all she said. Kazima was hardly in a position to refuse her mother's request. She stood up and turned to the door without a word, perhaps subconsciously hoping that her obedience would soften whatever punishment was in store for her the next day. Safe in the sanctuary of her room, Kazima curled up on top of her covers and processed everything that had happened. Never in her life had she felt so stupid. How could she have failed to see how dangerous this mission would be? Kazima was unsure whether or not she had slept at all that night. Her brain kept replaying things in a constant loop. She felt so ashamed of what she had done. She had hurt her mum deeply, and it might be a long time until she was ever truly forgiven. Not only that, but this could potentially be the end of the ARC project. If the police took time to investigate her links with Trevor and David, then that would be it. Their hard work gone in an instant. It was approaching 8 a.m. when Kazima made her first tentative steps downstairs. The nerves she felt in that moment were a million times worse than anything she had experienced at the Jessop's farm or in Miss Fleck's bakery. When she finally reached the foot of the stairs, she took a deep breath, then stepped through to the kitchen. Her mum was sitting where she had left her. Kazima would have assumed that she hadn't moved all night if it wasn't for the fact that she was now wearing her work uniform and had the morning's newspaper in front of her. Kazima's mum looked her daughter in the eye for the first time since she'd spoken to the police. "Sit down and listen," she said. "Mum, I just wanted to say how," Kazima began. "I said sit down and listen," her mum snapped. Kazima was glad that the others couldn't see her at that moment. All the confidence and stability they relied on from their Shikra had vanished. Sat there at the breakfast table, with shoulders hunched forwards and putting her last remaining energy into holding back her tears, Kazima was just a scared little girl. "Next to losing your father," her mum began, "yesterday was one of the worst days of my life." The first of the tears began to stream down Kazima's cheeks. Her mum wasn't one for dramatics and exaggerations, and she never talked about Kazima's dad. This was really bad. "Kazima, you are my world. I have raised you to know right from wrong. I have given you all that I can give. So to do this, to be so reckless and cruel, it destroys me." Kazima looked up briefly to see that her mum, the strongest woman she knew, was crying too. Everybody needs to cry sometimes, and as a little girl, she would sometimes hear her mum's cries through the bedroom wall, especially when her father's health was at its worst. This was the first time, though, she'd seen her mum cry in the flesh, and to see it made her own tears sting even harder. "You have brought shame on our family's name," her mum continued. "The Jessops will quickly tell others what you have done, and your poor cousin, well, I wouldn't be surprised if he never wants to see you again." She paused for a moment and unfolded the newspaper that was in front of her. "And the timing of your stunt yesterday could not have been worse. Read this." Kazima's mum pushed the newspaper over to her daughter. Kazima looked down to the main headline. "PM to axe youth card scheme." "We got briefed about this at the end of yesterday's shift," her mum said. The government is pooling all of their funding, hundreds of millions every year, and the youth card is going to stop. You and your friends will need to start paying for buses again. Kazima nervously waited, unsure if it was now safe to go back for her to speak. Is that not good news for bus drivers? She eventually asked. If young people have to pay, does that not mean more money for the bus companies? That's not how it works. Were you not listening? The bus companies get paid huge sums from the government to compensate them for the youth card passengers. That money is going to stop, and we'll get far fewer young passengers when the scheme ends. They want to pay our fares. Our boss has already told us that when the youth card stops, they'll need to make cutbacks. Meaning? Meaning fewer buses and fewer drivers. I might be out of a job, Kazima. As David walked towards Kazima's house, it was hard to know whether or not paying her a visit was a good idea. It was very possible that the police, or even Kazima herself, had told her mum of his involvement at the farm. If that was the case, then he would definitely not be a welcome visitor. His presence might end up getting Kazima into even more trouble, or worse, encourage her mum to get in touch with his own parents to report what had happened. Still, Kazima was his friend, and he needed to show that she had his support. Also, more importantly, there was a lot of unfinished business to take care of. The town fair was only a week away, and if their plans for Mr. Torrance were to go ahead, they needed to organise some decisive action. When David finally reached Kazima's door, he gave a small knock and stood back in trepidation. He did his very best to compose himself for speaking with Kazima's mum, trying to keep his cool and portray his innocence. After a few tense moments, he heard footsteps approach the door, and, to his great relief, it was Kazima who opened it. Looking at his friends, David was quite taken aback. It was after lunchtime, and Kazima was still in her dressing gown, and her eyes were puffy and red. She was clearly not in a good place. You can't be here, she said to David, her eyes fixed on the doormat at her feet. Mum's due back from work soon, and I'm not allowed visitors. Please go. David didn't feel like he was in a position to protest. He didn't want to make things worse for Kazima. I just wanted to check that you were all right, he said. I'm meeting the others after dinner. Will you be able to make it? You're kidding, right? Waltz right back to our meeting place on the Jessop's land the day after they called the police on me? Clearly you have no idea how much trouble I'm in. Mum's got me under house arrest. If I'm not at school, then I'm at home. That's my life for the foreseeable future. You can factor me out of any meetings, any ARC stuff at all. I'm done. David had anticipated that Kazima would be grounded. His parents would have punished him similarly, if not worse. He'd already spoken with Chris and Trevor about the scenario, and they'd all agreed that the plan for Mr. Torrance needed to go ahead with or without Kazima's involvement. I understand, said David. We'll find a way of updating you back at school. Let us know when the heat dies down, and we'll arrange another meeting then. Work out who to target next. David, have you not been listening at all? Kazima was starting to get visibly frustrated. Her cheeks were becoming flushed, and she was staring at David in disbelief. I am out. The project needs to go on without me. I can't do it anymore. Goodbye, David. Before David could even begin to protest, Kazima had slammed the front door shut. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kazima, the project's driving force, its creative spark, was going to turn her back on the very thing she helped create. Kazima didn't give up on things. She was the most strong-willed, stubborn person David knew, and her behaviour that afternoon seemed so out of character. Dismayed, David started walking home, dreading how he was going to break this news to the others. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Stay tuned for chapter 15. Bye.